Yo, yo, yo. Hey guys, welcome back to another awesome edition of the Best Practices Show podcast. Happy Monday, everybody. And on Mondays around here, we do something called Metric Mondays. A little bite-sized piece of information so you can use it and improve your practice. And today we're going to talk about one of the most misunderstood numbers in all of dentistry, overhead percentage, and how you need to think differently about it so it doesn't silently kill your practice. So please listen up. I hope you guys enjoy this, and we'll see you soon. Hey guys, welcome back to the Best Practices Show podcast. Happy Monday, everybody. Hope your week is a good one. And if you've been following along, every Monday we have what's called Metric Monday, where Barrett Straub, Dr. Barrett Straub and I, our CEO, we go through some metrics that can help you improve your practice. And these are designed as little bite-sized pieces of information with countermeasures. You'll find out what those are shortly, that you can put into play today. So Barrett, thanks for being back, brother. Appreciate you.
My pleasure. I love these Metric Mondays, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So maybe you give some context on the story. So if somebody goes back and where are we at in the story today?
Yeah, so those of you that have been following ACT and know what we do, we've been talking about what we call our financial gaps model, and it is a kind of a customized financial model for private practice dentistry, and it walks us through the cash story of a dental practice, meaning how does a dollar of production, what happens to that dollar of production as it turns into collection, as it flows out in overhead, as it eventually, a portion of that dollar ends up as what we call true profit, meaning the doctor can deposit it in his or her personal banking account. And so we're kind of using the metrics that walk through that story and how each of these metrics tell a little bit more about that whole story so that the doctor can understand. And today's a good one. Yeah. And today we're talking about overhead percentage. And so tell us about that, Kirk.
Yeah, I'll just say this. You're going to see Barrett's a smart one. But listen, I've been doing this for 30 years. Overhead is not overhead. Remember back in the days, people were like, what's your overhead? Well, my overhead's 62. My overhead's 72. Like that. Now that you can't even use that because that's a function of a whole. You have to know the story in order to be able to use that number. So kind of walk us through this. How does this work?
Yeah, well, first of all, as a dentist myself, overhead's emotional. We all have these stories we tell ourselves about what overhead is, what it should be, what that percentage. We often feel bad about ourselves when this percentage is higher than what we read in a magazine article or we heard on a podcast. And so one of the things to start to understand overhead and not have those emotional feelings is just understand why it is what it is. And we're going to share a little bit of a story that's different than maybe you've ever heard before, because as we study profitability in a dental business, overhead has changed for us. Meaning, let's first do this. Let's define it. And then we're going to get a little bit deeper and, hold on tight, listen, and we're going to send you off here shortly with some things to go back to your practice and study. So overhead percentage is the proportion of your revenue that's consumed by your operating expenses, and that does not include doctor or dentist compensation. So it is basically, we have a bunch of revenue that we brought in. What percentage of that goes away in the form of all the costs, whether that's employee salaries, printer, toner, credit card fees, all of the normal and regular business expenses that we need to run our business, not including doctor expenses. That is how we define, and in the dental world, how overhead is defined.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. And I get this one. What about an associate? You mean all doctors? And can you just give it?
I mean all doctors.
Give us a little sliver, because I get this. Well, like why? Why wouldn't you put a doctor in there as far as your overhead goes? No, I agree. And
yeah, and so in a minute we're going to share a profitability benchmark. So and we'll do it right now. So we want to compare apples to apples, right? We need to know, what does it cost to run this business? And I don't care if there's one doctor or 18 doctors. What does it cost to run this business before a doctor gets paid? Because doctors get paid all sorts of different things. And when you're the owner, you sometimes pay yourself beyond a market rate. And so overhead is just, what is the cost to run the business before a provider gets paid? So we always say, everyone's asking, well, what should it be? And there's no magic benchmark, but a starting point is this. You bring in revenue, and obviously there's 100% of revenue, and 60% of that goes away in overhead. If you have 60% overhead, you're in a good position. Obviously high 50s is better, but as we creep up in the 60s, as we'll lay the case for, your profitability gets highly pressured. So 60% overhead. Now, your remaining is 40%, right? We want 30% of that's likely going to go towards provider compensation. Why? Because that's what it takes to pay dentists a competitive, marketable rate. Right. Those of you that are associates or have associates or thinking about associates, think about how you pay them. We're usually talking about a percentage of collections. At a percentage of production, it's got to be a higher percentage, or a percentage of collections minus lab fees. And it's roughly 30%. And there's a bunch of different ways, but roughly you should be, doctors and providers, you should expect to pay. And if you're a single owner doctor, think of that as your salary, 30% of revenue. Yeah. Now, we want 10% left over, because the owner, the entrepreneur who has risked, deserves some ROI. So from a starting point, we have revenue, 60% goes away in overhead, 30% goes towards the doctor or doctors, and there's 10% left over for the owner/entrepreneur. Let me pause there. Kirk, layer on there.
Yeah, so I love this because, and I'm going to use anecdotally, again, 30 years of doing this, it's so important to do what Barrett says, because if you're I've heard people that are experts in dentistry say, don't worry what your overhead is, just keep producing. Well, that is not valid anymore, because there's so many reasons, and if you've been following along, you know it. Now, the second thing is, if your overhead's higher than 65%, I'm just going to say this, you are stressed. Here's why. You have no margin. You have no financial margin, because when it snows, we live in Wisconsin, and we actually had a snowstorm many years ago, if you guys remember this, in Washington, D.C., where our doctors could not get out of their driveways for more than 7 days. Now, that affects cash flow. And when your overhead is 65%, you have no room to breathe. And so when there's fluctuations in collections, you know who doesn't get paid? You don't. So it's really important. This is a health measure. It's not so much a money measure. It's a business health. And I'll throw one more thing in this. If we were buying up practices, we don't do that, but if we were buying up practices, we would only want the profitable ones. We do not want practices that are not profitable, because we cannot make an ROI. So this is a huge advantage for somebody who's looking to transition in the next 10 years.
Yeah, that's a solid point. And let's focus on that. And then let's back up to the more simplistic ideas. If after paying yourself a marketable competitive wage, there's not money left over, you could make the case, or others will, that you don't have a profitable business. Because if you went away and said, I'm not going to practice dentistry, but I'm still in my business and I'm going to hire someone to do it, you're going to pay that person roughly 30% of collections, and there's going to be nothing left over for you as the owner. And so we're digging in deep, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but I want to back up. I want to simplify overhead expenses, because again, it's emotional. Well, what goes in what bucket, and what do you call operating expenses versus team salaries? All overhead, all it is just all the expenses that are on your P&L.
Yeah.
Minus doctor expenses.
Minus your loan payments and your tax payments. Now, I didn't get that as an entrepreneur. Right. I thought, like, I was just telling Tom, I was so dumb when I started. I thought repaying my line of credit was lowering my overhead, or lowering my tax liability. That is not overhead, correct?
Right. And those are on the cash flow statement. Those are not even on your P&L. So let's back up even simpler. Your profit and loss statement, you print it from your QuickBooks. All those line items on there, whether it's team compensation, whether it's CE event, whether it's team lunch, whether it's the pens and paper that you buy, those are deductible business expenses. Deductible means that they reduce the taxable income that the IRS is going to tax you on as a pass-through entity. Most dental practices are LLCs or S corps, and in that case, you're as a pass-through entity, meaning the profit of your business is you personally, your profit, and you're going to get taxed the same on it. So every time you buy a pen, you pay $1 for that pen, and that reduces your taxable income to the business by that same dollar. So very simplified, you pull a P&L. There's a bunch of expenses on it. Those are deductible overhead expenses. At the bottom, there's a total expense dollar. That's your overhead.
Yeah.
And then you subtract, and then you divide that against your revenue, and you get a percentage. There's nothing more. Now, when we're like, that's too high, I'm spending too much money. Great. Now we worry about what bucket, whether it's supplies or marketing or discretionary or team comp. Now we worry about that. But the first step is not even to worry about what you're calling it. Just what is it? What's the total amount? And what percentage of revenue is it before you, doctor, get paid? That's all overhead is. It's fourth grade math, and it's very unemotional when you look at it that simplistically.
Okay, let's go to your favorite part of Metric Mondays. We're going to call it countermeasure.
Yes.
Okay, Barrett, I'm listening to this. I have a high overhead. How do I lower my overhead percentage?
Yes. So let's think about that model of 60% overhead, 30% goes to the doctor, 10% left over. Well, what happens when your overhead creeps up to 65? Your ROI now as an owner doctor is 5%. What happens when it's now 72% and you're still paying yourself 30%? Now your true profitability is actually negative. You're actually losing from a cash flow statement money. So when our overhead grows as a percentage, what it means is that there's less money. There's less money to pay ourselves. There's less money to pay our associates. There's less money to take home as ROI. There's less money to invest back in our practices. There's just less profitability. So you're going to get to the point, some of us that are like, I want to lower my overhead percentage. Okay, there's two ways to do it. Now, historically, the message is always spend less. Right. And we get really emotional, we get defensive, and we dig in and we start getting angry with our team about we're buying too good of pens and we should buy the cheaper printer paper and we're going to go to a worse lab and we're going to penny pinch. And I'm even going to say sometimes you need to do that. But let's first figure out if we need to and why your overhead is high. So you can lower your overhead percentage two ways. One, spend less. Okay. So let's go through that. Let's say, you're just been kind of spending like a sailor and we need to rein it in. Okay. You're literally going to take that P&L every month. You're going to analyze your expenses. You're going to go line by line and say, do I need that? Do I need that? What even is that? What is this line item that I don't even know what is? You're going to go through your P&L. You're going to go through your credit card, and you're just going to throw out the expenses you don't need. You could possibly negotiate better deals with your suppliers. You're going to improve your scheduling. An unknown way to improve your overhead is to do more with the 8 hours you already have. Right? So I'm going to be there 8 hours. I'm going to pay my people X because they're going to be there 8 hours. The lights are going to be on 8 hours. Can I extract more profit from that same expense? You've already spent it. And so we want to spend less, but we also want to optimize our output by our business, which is doing more dentistry, more profitable dentistry. And so there is ways to spend less, and it's basically roll up your sleeves and get after it.
Yeah. Now you also talk about outsourcing, like strategically, what does that mean?
Outsourcing, and I'm not an expert on this, but there's people that do things better than us, whether that's insurance verification, whether that's billing. I don't know. There's a lot of that stuff out there. And so I could see this as two ways. One, outsourcing can help you save money. And I think outsourcing could cost you money, right? Yeah. There's some things like if you outsource everything and yet you still have 3 people up front,
right?
Now you're spending more than you need to. So we all have to find that balance of, how can I run this business? And you need to spend money. You can't be super cheap, because I could also make the case if your overhead is too low, there's a potential that you're not investing enough back into the future of your practice. And 1, 2, 3 years from now, things might be harder. And so I'm not at all saying be super cheap at all. I'm saying I want you to look at every expense on your P&L and say, yep, I'm proud of that. I like that lab. They're really good. And I'm going to pay that, because that's what it needs to produce the dentistry that I need. I want you just simply, if you determine you're spending too much, which will help you determine in a minute, that you just go through and get rid of the waste. That's it.
And I'll add in how. Now, what Barrett said is exactly true. Now, I'll tell you how we do it with our clients. We have them fill out our financial gaps calculator. Now, this is my favorite part. They actually have to go through the hard work of putting it all in the right place. And I love how you say, Barrett, sometimes you got to man up or woman up and learn about your business. And then they get mad. They're like, what the heck is this? This is a lot of money. That's the first piece. They start to understand what these dollar amounts out are and where to put them. And then you get a little mad. And that's don't stay there, but you'll start to ask yourself questions like, what the heck is that? And the first part of it is just knowing where the numbers are at. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Again, back to that emotion. Don't get emotional. Just get knowledge. Right. Understand my overhead. I collect 1.2, and my overhead dollar value of that is 600,000. I'm at 50%. So just literally do that simple math and then say, okay, what makes up that 50%, and it's going to be higher than that. What makes up that 700,000 of that 1.2 that is going out the door?
Right.
And it's lab and it's supplies and it's team comp. And you look at all those items and just make sure it's what you thought it was.
Right. So that's the first thing we could do. We could spend less. What's another way I can lower my overhead?
Now, this is the one that no one else is talking about in dentistry. And this is the one that most people actually should pay more attention to. So if you're listening and you're like, my overhead's 75%, your natural human instinct is to say, I'm spending too much. And you might be partially right. But I'll bet 9 out of 10 times the reason your overhead is high is because your profit margin is too small. Let me explain. And right here, this moment, this is the pearl for today's Metric Monday. If you take nothing home, this is it. Perk your ears up, listen, absorb this. We need to recognize that we spend our overhead to produce our gross production. All those items on our P&L, all the gloves, all the masks, all that stuff, we need to spend it so that we can produce whatever our true gross production is. But we calculate that percentage against what is collected or true revenue.
Okay, you got to say that a second time because that's so good.
We spend our overhead, we spend our expenses so that we can produce our dentistry. But our overhead percentage is calculated against our revenue. So those of you that have been following our financial gaps model, there's 2 gaps between what we're talking about. We have the effort gap, which is gross production minus net production. And then we have collections gap, meaning of your net production, how much of that do you collect? So there's space between our gross production, our true one master fee output of our practice, and the amount of money that hits our bank account. Yeah. The bigger difference, the bigger the gap, the more space between those 2 numbers. I don't care how frugal you are, your overhead percentage will be high and out of whack.
Yeah.
And so we are actually coaching more dentists to improve their overhead percentage by improving their profit margin than by spending less.
Yeah.
I'm assuming all of us are going to, if we own a business, are going to look at our profit and loss statement and try to spend in an intelligent way. Yeah. And most of us are still going to be out of whack in our overhead. Now comes in the profit margin. And what I just talked about, how your overhead is spent versus calculated, will blow many minds and say, oh, That makes total sense. I should probably stop worrying about the quality of pens that I'm buying and worry more about my write-offs, my lack of true collections, and these two first gaps in our financial gap model.
Yeah, this is so well said. And as you start to do this, your overhead percentage will go down. Let's say you don't produce anymore and you collect more. I go from 1 million to 1.2 million, but I'm not producing anymore. I'm collecting more. You can see your overhead percentage goes down without adding any days, without cutting any more pens, without like reducing costs. It's just being smarter about your business. And I love that. And I'll leave you with one last tip too. And Barrett and Tom both helped me with this. There are two lines in your practice, and we're going to get into this in the next Metric Monday. One of them is how your expenses are going. And then it's how your collections are going. And they should never be parallel. They should be diverging, meaning your expenses cannot grow at the rate of your revenue. They actually have to be growing at a lower percentage point than your revenue. And those create diverging lines, which increases your profit margin, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit. And that is when you really start to understand your overhead. Any last thoughts, Barrett, before we wrap this up on overhead percentage?
Yeah, there's two quick questions that you can go ask yourself tomorrow in your dental office to determine if it's a profit margin issue, and most will find that it is. If your overhead is north of 70%, I want you to do one thing. I want you to go and look at what your overhead dollar figure is. How much have you spent either a monthly or a yearly or a quarterly, okay? And you know that that's a percentage of your revenue. Now, I want you to take that same dollar figure and say, but what if we collected 100% of my net production? What would that percentage be? And so let's say you're collecting only 95% of your net production. Now you take that same spend and you divide it against that higher dollar value. You're going to watch your potential overhead go down several percentage points. Now, the next step, this is a really big one. You're going to say, if you're a PPO provider and you have lots of write-offs, I want you to say, what's my overhead spend? It's a dollar value. You're going to divide against your true gross production. And in doing this with our clients, which we do all the time, I have seen 75% overheads with that calculation go down to like 44%. Yeah. And so why that's important is to say, in that case, you're at a 75% overhead, you divide against your gross production, all of a sudden that number is 45%. Is that practice spending too much? I'm going to say no. They're only spending 45% of their output. That's actually not bad. Their challenge is that their profit margin is so thin that it's going to be out of whack until they improve their profit margin. They almost can't spend less because then they can't produce. So those are two questions to go, and that'll help you determine, am I spending too much or is it a profit margin issue? And that will help determine how and what strategy you use to decrease that percentage.
So well said. Now I'm going to speak to the listener. Your head probably hurts and it's Monday. Mm-hmm. It probably does. But I'm telling you, if you get this right, it is absolutely life-changing. Now, you might be on your way to work and you're like, oh, I don't have time for this. Listen, if this is hard for you to figure out and it's frustrating, don't stay there. We have a lot of tools in the Best Practices Association you can join, and it will walk you through step by step how to do this. We also have our To the Top Study Club where you can hang out with other people. And actually, this next quarter is how to know your data. And if you're just like, I've tried everything, I don't know what to do, this is what we do. We're coaches. We work with the best practices in the country. They're not broken. They're just, how do I get better? And they don't have the time to think about how do they get better. So don't sit there and stay there. Raise your hand. We're here to help you every step of the way. And if you do it, you can have a great practice and a great life. So keep tuning in to Metric Money. Now I'm going to give you a little, what do you call this? Like foreshadowing next week.
Yes. Yeah.
We talk. I was thinking about a word. We're talking about overhead percentage today. Next Monday, we're going to go into gross profit percentage. And those are different. People used to think overhead is profit. No, it's not. So make sure you tune in next week when we talk about gross profit percentage. Thank you for being on, brother.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, stick around while we say goodbye to everybody else. But thank you guys for tuning into the podcast and Metric Monday. We are here to help you every step of the way. Don't stay there. And if you use this information, I'm telling you, little bits of this every single Monday, you can make your practice better bit by bit. So keep tuning in. Keep sharing the word. I can't even talk. It's Monday. Keep sharing the good word with your friends. And until we see you guys next time, or you hear from us next time, keep watching or keep listening to the Best Practices Show. You guys enjoy your Monday.